Senator from Rhode Island.
Mr. President, may I ask unanimous consent that the pending quorum call be vitiated?
Without objection.
And may I ask unanimous consent to speak as if in morning business for up to 20 minutes?
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Last week, the former head of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, Robert M. White, passed away at the age of 92. Dr. White served this nation under 5 presidents and pioneered the peaceful use of satellites to understand our weather and climate. We do have environmental problems, and they're serious ones. The preservation of species among them, he said. But the climate is the environmental problem that's so pervasive in its effects on the society. The climate is really the only environmental characteristic that can utterly change our society and our civilization. That was in 1977. That same year, James F. Black, a top scientific researcher at the Exxon Corporation, gave that company's executives a similar warning. There is general scientific agreement, he told Exxon's management committee, that the most likely manner in which mankind is influencing the global climate is through carbon dioxide release from the burning of fossil fuels. According to emerging reports, Exxon executives kept that warning a closely guarded company secret for years. I rise today for the 115th time to urge that we wake up to the threat of climate change. I rise in the midst of a decades-long, purposeful corporate campaign of misinformation, which has held this Congress and this nation back from taking meaningful action to prevent that utter change. Scrutiny of the corporate campaign of misinformation intensifies, and scrutiny of the fossil fuel polluters behind it intensifies. And so the regular cast of right-wing climate denier attack dogs have got their hackles up. On May 6th, I gave a speech here on the floor. The speech compared the misinformation campaign by the fossil fuel industry about the dangers of carbon pollution to the tobacco industry's misinformation campaign about the dangers of its product. The relevance of that comparison is that the United States Department of Justice, under the civil provisions of the Federal Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organization Statute, RICO for short, brought an action against the tobacco industry. The United States alleged that the tobacco industry's misinformation campaign was fraudulent, and the United States won in a lengthy and thorough decision by United States District Judge Gladys Kessler. You can go ahead and read them. DOJ's complaint and Judge Kessler's decision can be found at the websites of the Justice Department and the Public Health Law Center, respectively, and they're linked on my website, whitehouse.senate.gov/climate change. I'll warn you that Judge Kessler's decision is a long one, but it makes good reading. The comparison is strong. There are whole sections of the Department of Justice civil RICO complaint and whole sections of Judge Kessler's decision where you can remove the word tobacco and put in the word carbon, and remove the word health and put in the word climate, and the parallel with the fossil fuel industry climate denial campaign is virtually perfect. This is not an idea I just cooked up. Look at the academic work of Professor Robert Bruhl of Drexel University and Professor Riley Dunlap of Oklahoma State University. Look at the investigative work of Naomi Oreskes' book, Merchants of Doubt, David Michael's book, Doubt is Their Product, and Gerald Markowitz and David Rosner's book, Deceit and Denial, describing this industry-backed machinery of deception. Look at the journalistic work of Neela Banerjee, Lisa Song, David Hazemeyer, and John Cushman Jr. in the recent reporting of Inside Climate News about what Exxon knew about climate change versus the falsehoods Exxon chose to tell the public. Look at a separate probe by journalists Sarah Jerving, Katie Jennings, Masako Melissa Hirsch, and Suzanne Rust in the Los Angeles Times. From all their work, we know now that Exxon, for instance, knew about the effect of its carbon pollution as far back as the late 1970s, but ultimately chose to fund a massive misinformation campaign rather than tell the truth. No corporation, said professor and climate change activist Bill McKibben, has ever done anything this big and this bad. And just today, the person who probably knows the most about the tobacco litigation, the Assistant Attorney General of the United States who prosecuted that case as a civil matter and won it in the United States District Court, Sharon Eubanks, said about the climate denial RICO idea, "I think a RICO action is plausible and should be considered." Here's how Judge Kessler depicted the culpable conduct of the tobacco industry in her decision in that case. Quote, "Defendants have intentionally maintained and coordinated their fraudulent position on addiction and nicotine as an important part of their overall efforts to influence public opinion and persuade people that smoking is not dangerous." End quote. Now compare that to the findings of Dr. Brule, whose research shines light on the dark money campaigns that fund and support climate denial. This climate denial operation, to quote Dr. Brule, is, quote, "a deliberate and organized effort to misdirect the public discussion and distort the public's understanding of climate," end quote. The parallels between what the tobacco industry did and what the fossil fuel industry is doing now are so striking, I suggested in my speech of May 6, that it was worth a look, that civil discovery could reveal whether the fossil fuel industry's activities crossed that same line into racketeering. I said that again in an op-ed piece I wrote in the Washington Post on May 29th regarding the civil RICO action against tobacco. And oh my, what a caterwauling has ensued from the fossil fuel industry trolls. Here is a quick highlight reel of the tempest of right-wing invective. One climate denier, Christopher Monckton, declared Senator Whitehouse is a fascist goon. Another denier compared me to Torquemada, the infamous torturer of the Inquisition. And the official Exxon responder got so excited about this suggestion that he used a word I'm not even allowed to use on this Senate floor. He forgot Rule 1 in crisis management: don't lose your cool. The right-wing website Breitbart.com responded by calling me, quote, the preposterous Democrat senator for Rhode Island, and saying the notion that there is an industry-funded effort to mislead the American people about the harm caused by carbon pollution is a joke, a conspiracy theory on par with Area 51 or the faking of the moon landing. Well, tell that to the tobacco industry. Paul Gigot, the editorial page editor of the Wall Street Journal, said global warming concerns are based on computer models, not by actual evidence, not by actual evidence of what we've seen so far. Tell that to the scientists who measure the effects of climate change every day, particularly in our oceans. The polluter-funded George Marshall Institute, a long-time climate denial outfit, and who knows how they got to take respectable George C. Marshall's name and slap it on the front of a climate denial industry front, but they did. They wrote that this was an attack on constitutional rights. Well, that kind of presumes the answer, because there's no constitutional right to commit fraud. Similarly, Calvin Beisner, founder of another phony baloney industry front called the Cornwall Alliance, said the same. The mere suggestion of considering this action represents, quote, a direct attack on the rights to freedom of speech and the press guaranteed by the First Amendment and is, quote, horrifically bad for science. Coming from a science denial outfit, that concern for science is rich. And again, fraud is not protected by the First Amendment. In the National Review, I was accused of wanting to launch, and I quote them, organized crime investigations against people and institutions that disagree with me about global warming in order to lock people up as mafiosi. Crime? Lock people up? Let's remember, Mr. President, we're talking about civil RICO, not criminal. No one went to jail in the tobacco case. Investigating the organized climate denial scheme under civil RICO is not about putting people in jail. Query why the National Review would mislead people about such an obvious fact. And they're not alone. The right-wing blogosphere is lit up with nonsense about how this is a criminal charge. Read the tobacco complaint. It's on the Department of Justice website. Even people who purport to be legal scholars are misleading folks that way. All a civil RICO case does is get people to have to actually tell the truth, under oath, in front of an actual impartial judge or jury, and under cross-examination, which the Supreme Court has described as the greatest legal invention ever invented for the discovery of truth. No more spin and deception. But that's exactly the audience polluters and their allies can't bear. So the flacks set off criminal smokescreens and launch fascist goon and Torquemada hysterics. A few weeks ago, 20 scientists agreed with me and wrote a letter to Attorney General Lynch supporting the idea of using civil RICO. That was too much for the troll-in-chief for the fossil fuel industry, the Wall Street Journal editorial page. The Wall Street Journal editorial page has long been an industry science denial mouthpiece. They use the same playbook every time. 1, deny the science. 2, question the motives of reformers. And 3, exaggerate the costs of the reforms. For instance, when scientists warned that chlorofluorocarbons could break down the atmosphere's ozone layer, the Wall Street Journal ran editorials for decades devaluing the science, attacking scientists and reformers, and exaggerating the costs associated with regulating CFCs. Turns out they were dead wrong. When acid rain was falling in the Northeast, the Wall Street Journal editorial page questioned the science, claimed the sulfur dioxide cleanup effort was driven by politics, and said fixing it carried a huge price tag. Ultimately, the Journal's editorial page, after years of this, had to recant and admit that the cap and trade program for sulfur dioxide, and I quote them, saves about $700 million annually compared with the cost of traditional regulation, and has been reducing emissions by 4 million tons annually. End quote. Now, on climate change, the Journal is back to the same pattern. Deny the science, question the motives of climate scientists, exaggerate the costs of tackling carbon pollution. For decades, the Journal has been persistently publishing editorials against taking any action to prevent man-made climate change. On this, the editorial page said, by talking about civil RICO, I'm trying to forcibly silence the denial apparatus. Forcibly silence, first of all, against the billions of the Koch brothers and the billions of ExxonMobil, fat chance that I have much force to use. And silence, I don't want them silent. I want them testifying in a forum where they have to tell the truth. Is the Journal really saying that in a forum where climate deniers have to tell the truth, their only response would have to be silence? Making them tell the truth forcibly silences them? Because the only thing civil RICO silences is fraud. By the way, the Journal editorial never mentions that the government won the civil RICO case against tobacco, and on very similar facts. That would detract from the fable. Who does the Journal cast as their victim in their fable? Well, none other than Willie Soon, who they said I singled out for, here's what they said, having published politically inconvenient research on changes in solar radiation, end quote. Politically inconvenient research. Actually, what's inconvenient for Dr. Soon is that the New York Times reported that he gets more than half his funding from big fossil fuel interests like ExxonMobil and the Charles G. Koch Foundation to the tune of $1.2 million and didn't disclose it. Dr. Soon's research contracts even gave his industry backers a chance for comment and input before he published. And he referred to the papers he produced for them as, quote, deliverables, end quote. In case anyone listening doesn't know this, that's not how real science works. Of course, none of this sordid financial conflict is even mentioned by the Wall Street Journal editorial page. They'd rather pretend that Dr. Soon is being singled out for politically inconvenient views. Please. It gets better. In the editorial, the role of neutral expert commenting on all of this goes to Georgia Tech's Judith Curry. She offers the opinion that my, quote, demand for legal persecution represents a new low in the politicization of science. This is a particularly rich and conflict-riddled opinion, as Ms. Curry is herself a repeat anti-climate witness, performing regularly in committees for Republicans here in Congress. Again, no mention of this interest of Ms. Curry's in the Wall Street Journal editorial. The fossil fuel industry's climate denial machine rivals or exceeds that of the tobacco industry in size, scope, and complexity. Its purpose is to cast doubt about the reality of climate change in order to forestall moves toward cleaner fuels and to allow the Kochs and the Exxons of the world to continue making money at everybody else's expense. And the Wall Street Journal editorial page plays its part in this machine. Even though it's only the editorial page and not the journal's well-regarded newsroom, facts and logic are supposed to matter. Ignoring the successful tobacco litigation, omitting the salient fact of Dr. Soon being paid by the industry involved in his research, and bringing in a climate denier as their neutral voice without even disclosing that conflict, I'd like to see the Wall Street Journal editorial page get that editorial by the editorial standards of their own newsroom. So why? Why all the histrionics on the far right, Mr. President? Why all the deliberate subterfuge between civil and criminal RICO? Why all the name-calling? Have we perhaps touched a little nerve? Have we maybe hit a bit too close to home? Maybe a civil RICO case is indeed plausible and should be considered. Are the cracks in the dark castle of climate denial, as it crumbles, maybe beginning to rattle the occupants? Whatever the motivation of the Wall Street Journal and other right-wing climate denial outfits, it is clearly long past time for this climate denial scheme to come in from the talk shows and the blogosphere and have to face the kind of truth-testing audience that a civil RICO investigation could provide. It's time to let the facts take their place and let climate denial face that greatest legal engine ever invented for the discovery of truth. Mr. President, I yield the floor.